So now that you've installed the Vp Toolkit plugin and have created a new project, we're going to set up the level configuration and your nDisplay cluster. We're going to do some stuff. So first we're going to go over to the stage widget and click on the little stage icon. And we're going to create a level structure. So I'm just going to name this something similar to my project, VPT setup. So we're going to decide whether we want to do a new stage level or select an already existing stage level. Since this video is for an initial setup, we're going to go with a new stage level. And then you're going to select your nDisplay config. You can either select from the 3 templates here. The first one is ICVFX Frustum. This is the standard way you're going to see most of these productions working. This is with a single camera view. You can choose 2 camera, which is going to give you 2 in-camera VFX components, and those are going to give you 2 frustums on your screen. Or you can choose default viewport, which is going to give you no frustum. This is usually used if you need to track the entire screen instead of having a frustum viewport. So we're going to choose the in-camera VFX frustum, and then we're also going to select add frustum cam. And that's going to bring in a cinema camera for us. And then just hit this little circle button up here. This will build your level system. Once you build your level system, you'll be in a dark level with no environment in it. We're going to go back into the stage settings and add an environment. This is part of the in-camera VFX template. And then you can just hit add. So now just a quick overview of what that did. You can see if you go to your levels tab, if you don't have a levels tab, you can go to window and then scroll down here and select level, and that will bring up this tab. I like to have it docked over here with my layers and my outliner. So our persistent level is the project level that was created for our setup here. The curved stage is our environment, and then the VPT setup stage level is going to be the stage level for this studio. So once we've done that, we're going to want to go to our project settings, maps and modes, and then we're going to want to select that project level that we just created as our default editor and game startup map. So you just want to select the project name that you created with project level at the end. Select both of those and then close that. So we're going to go into our nDisplay config. So this is using Unreal Engine's nDisplay plugin to do our projection mapping here. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to determine what we're projecting to. This can either be a flat screen like a monitor or a TV, or in our case, this is a LED wall. First, I'm going to just quickly show you a flat mesh. So if you take the 1x1 static mesh here and then just connect it to your root component, you'll see a little thing drop in. We'll just lift this up a little bit so we can see it. And then if we change the size of this in centimeters, this will change our screen size. Since we're not using a flat mesh, I'm going to go through the process of bringing in our actual mesh here. We have a static mesh that was built based on the specifications of this LED wall that I've already imported into our project. So if you go to Vp Toolkit, Concept Kit, and you go to Warp Mesh, you can see our wall here. These meshes have to be specifically built for this purpose. I'll have a link below to the Unreal Engine documentation that gives you the specifications of what a nDisplay projection mesh needs to be. This will be built in a 3D design program, 3D sculpting program like Maya, Blender, whatever your specifications are. So we're just going to drag that mesh into our config and connect it to our root. You'll see your screen mesh generate in this viewport. So when you originally import this mesh, you want to make sure that you unclick the generate light map UVs. That's going to make it so that Unreal Engine doesn't automatically generate UVs for this mesh. You're also going to want to go in the details of your mesh asset and search for use full precision UVs. And then you're just going to want to enable that. Our LED wall mesh is actually rotated 90 degrees, so we want to just make sure that this is facing the correct direction. You always want to use the grid at the bottom here to just make sure that the dimensions of your mesh are correct and that the position is correct. So now we want to place the LED wall in relation to our 0 point. Basically, this is the origin of your tracking data. This is where all of your physical and virtual objects will relate to each other. Another thing to note is where the LED wall mesh 0 point is. So the LED wall mesh 0 point is going to determine how you move the LED wall mesh wall around. I generally like to have them made at the bottom center of the LED wall. This gives me the ability to measure from the very center of the LED wall to whatever I determine as my 0 point and be able to have a fairly accurate measurement. If you need to make any further adjustments or offsets, you can also go up to your components and add a nDisplay transform. So we'll just connect that to our root, and then we'll connect our mesh, our LED wall mesh, to that. And then this is currently at our 0 point, so this kind of becomes our new 0 point here for this LED wall mesh. This is a good way to offset different meshes and control your environment. Now, these are things that you all want to be relative to your physical LED wall and your measurements. So I usually recommend measuring the distance to the wall to whatever you determine as your 0 point, and then the distance to both sides of the edges of the wall to know whether or not you're directly in the center and if your LED wall is in relation to your 0 point. Now you want to make sure that you offset for the bottom of the LED wall, because there's most likely going to be a small lift there. A lot of these are not specifically on the ground. So now that we've got our mesh in here and placed based on our stage offset, we're going to add a new cluster node. So a cluster node is really the machine that you're going to render your nDisplay on. This could be the same machine that you're working on, which is usually not recommended. And this could also be a render node or multiple render nodes. The render node is a separate machine, PC or server, that is used specifically for rendering your projection to a projector, a screen, or an LED wall. So you're going to put the IP address of the machine that you are rendering your nDisplay on. I'm just going to go down to Window and set this to the resolution of our LED wall, and then hit Add. So now you should see a window down here that is the same aspect ratio of whatever you're trying to project to. We have created a host, which is the actual machine that we're rendering to. We've created the node, which is the window that our projection lives inside of. And then we've created a viewport, which is the projection itself. So we're going to go to the viewport to set up our projection. First, you're going to want to make sure that the viewport is enabled. Then you're going to go to Origin View and select your default origin view. You can actually have multiple of these default origin views. Once we're set up here, I'll show you a little more about that. And then we're going to go to Projection Policy and then go to Mesh, since we're using a static mesh. And then we're going to select our static mesh. You should see a preview pop up of your projection on your mesh. So just a quick overview of what we have set up here. We have our root, which is the base of our stage. That is the 0 point of our stage and the 0 point of our tracking, otherwise known as the origin of the tracking, or root, or 0 point, or whatever you want to call it. We have our LED wall mesh, which is the virtual representation of our physical LED wall. We have the default viewpoint, which determines the view outside of your frustum. It's also known as the origin view. If I move this around, you can see that the perspective outside of the camera's view is changed. Generally, you want to keep this around where talent is going to be, because that will make it so that the reflections outside of what camera sees are accurate to where your talent is. We have the floor align plane, which is where you will set any type of height difference of your stage. So if you have a deck or a stage that is lifted above the ground, you can use this as a visual representation of that stage. Your in-camera VFX component, this is what drives your frustum projection. In here, you want to just make sure that your cinema camera is connected to your frustum. In here is where we determine the overscan of our frustum. If you need to make your frustum bigger or smaller, you can do it in here. You can also control that through the Vp Toolkit widget in your level. You can change the inner frustum offset and you can also add a soft edge to it. Sometimes people like to add a soft edge to the frustum so your reflections don't show a hard line between your frustum and your outer frustum. Something really important to note at the bottom here that a lot of people miss is if you go down to configuration and custom frame size, you can actually change the resolution of your frustum. I usually recommend to up this if you're using a high resolution LED wall or volume. By default, it's set to 2K, but we're going to change it to 3840 by 2160. If you're having issues with frame rate, you may want to turn this down, but if you're having aliasing and the level is showing a lot of objects that are phasing in and out and it seems like it's lower resolution than it should be, you're going to want to turn this up. And then just to go over some of the other settings that you're going to find in nDisplay here, you have region, which is the resolution of your projection, of your viewport that you're projecting in. You can have multiple viewports in one node. So that means that if you did half of your resolution in one viewport and then created another viewport and did another resolution, this is to send one signal out using multiple views from your virtual world. So let's save and compile that. And then we're gonna export this as an nDisplay config. So usually you wanna just put this in the root folder of your project here. I'm gonna leave the name the same. You can also hit these three little dots here and select export on save. And every time you hit save in this window, it will export another one of those configs. So now that your project's set up, we're going to run a program called Switchboard. Switchboard is a Python program that is supplied by Unreal Engine to operate your in-camera VFX or nDisplay stage. So to get to Switchboard, you have to go to your engine path, which by default is local disk C, program files, Epic Games, UE5, engine, plugins, scroll down to virtual production, and then you'll find Switchboard at the bottom here. And then we're going to go to source, Switchboard, and you'll see a Windows batch file here named Switchboard. When you run this for the first time, this may take a while to build the Python dependencies. Just let it go through the process, and if you have any errors, you may need to check out the Unreal Engine documentation on it. So once your Switchboard is fired up, it will most likely be an empty project, or it will prompt you for a new config. So you can see once I do a new config, it automatically detects my project being open. You want to just go through here and just double check everything to make sure that your paths are correct. We're going to go to settings, and then we're just going to turn off all of the multi-user settings here. So we're going to turn off launch, we're going to turn off auto build, auto static endpoint, and auto join. You can actually see there's an auto join enable down here as well, but we're going to leave all that off for now and then cover a little bit at the end of this video. And then I'm going to be releasing another video that does an in-depth dive into multi-user. So let's go to add device, and we're going to choose nDisplay. Click browse, and then browse to your project folder. and then select your nDisplay config that you exported out. I would recommend to create a desktop shortcut of your Switchboard batch file here, just so that you have easier access. You can just right click and do create shortcut and then drag that onto your desktop. We have one here, and then you will want to run what's called the Switchboard listener. So to run that, you can go to Tools and then click Listener. Or if you're not opening up Switchboard on this machine, you can go to the actual file path of it, which would be C, Program Files, Epic Games, UE5, Engine, Binaries, Win64, and then scroll down to Switchboard Listener. So once that is running on your render node or on the machine that you're running your nDisplay projection, you should be able to connect using this little connect here, and then just confirm your IP address of your render node, just so you make sure that you're sending to the correct machine, and then you should be able to start the connection with your nDisplay render. So the first time that you run nDisplay, it may take a while to compile the shaders of your project on your secondary machine. You should see a black screen for a little while until your nDisplay viewport or your nDisplay projection is brought up on screen. If you're running this on the same machine as your editor or as your base project that we've started, it will most likely take less time because it won't have to compile the shaders for the first time. So once your project has loaded up and your shaders are compiled, take a look at your projection and just make sure that everything is rendering correctly. Now to close the instance of nDisplay that's running on your node, you just hit this X next to your node. So once we've tested our nDisplay projection and made sure that everything's rendering correctly, we're going to set up multi-user, which is going to allow us to control our nDisplay render from an editor. We're also going to set up Switchboard to control the instance of Unreal Engine that we're going to be using to edit our scene in nDisplay. We're going to go to Add Device, Unreal, and I usually just name this Editor. If you have multiples of these, you can name them specifically based on the machine that they're running on, and then just put in the IP address of that machine or the machine that you plan to edit on. You'll want to make sure that you have a listener running on your editor machine as well, or the machine that you plan to edit your nDisplay projection on. I still have the project open, so I'm going to close that. We're going to go back into the Switchboard settings, and we're going to re-enable auto launch, auto build, auto static endpoint, and auto join. So at the bottom here, you can name your session. We can call this whatever we want. I'm just going to name this VPT S1, and so that's for session 1. And then as you go and create different sessions as you do changes, you can actually hit this plus button here, and it will just continue in numerical order. I'm going to start with 1. I'm going to connect and run my editor first. So once your editor is running, you're going to want to find your multi-user window. You can go up to Window and then Multi-User Browser. And we just want to make sure that it's connected here. And then we're going to run our render node. So once you confirm that your node has connected to your multi-user, you'll also see an icon up here that says MU in your plugin widget, which will indicate that you are in a multi-user session. So now we should have control over our level in real time. So I'm going to move a couple of these objects, set them up for the next steps of our setup here. Generally, when you're running an LED wall volume like this, you don't want to have virtual objects within your stage. They will not render correctly based on their perspective or depth of field. You can kind of play around with that and see what you like. So what multi-user is it is actually a form of source control. So what it's doing is it's logging your transactions. So every time you move something or change a setting, It is logging that and then sending it to your other machines that are connected into the session. This keeps all of your projects that are in your multi-user session up to date and synced. This does not save to your local copy of your project. So if you are in a multi-user session and you hit save, that does not actually save your project. It just sends any transactions over to the nodes that have not been synced. So now once you've made any changes to your level, there's a couple ways that you can do this. Since we are running a single project, running to both machines over our network on a shared drive, network shared drive, we want to close our nDisplay projection on our render node, and then go to source control on your bottom right here, and then persist session changes. And then hit persist. Wait until you get an indication that it has persisted. So if you'd like to continue editing and making changes to your level live in nDisplay, you can just reconnect and rerun your nDisplay instance on your render node, or just make local changes. You can eject from your multi-user session. And it will ask you if you'd like to persist changes. And if you hit yes, it will give you a list of changes. And once you're out of your multi-user session, you can continue to make changes to your project and hit save like you normally would. And once you've ejected out of your multi-user session, you just want to go back through and make sure you delete any existing multi-user sessions. Now, if you see a couple that you actually cannot delete, that means that they are owned by another node or another machine. So you want to go through your render nodes and find out which machine owns that multi-user session. This is the importance of starting up your editor first and having your editor create the multi-user session. If the multi-user section of this video didn't work for you over your network, or you'd like to know more about how multi-user is working, please check out my other video that goes over the specifics of multi-user.